Is there an introduction?
Welcome to Through the Eyes of She, Equity in Health, Education, Business, and Leadership for the African Woman in the 21st Century. Please utilize the chat and Q&A features on the side of your toolbar. Please use the Q&A feature to submit any questions for the panelists. This session is being recorded. Thank you. Sorry, everyone, just give us 1 second.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay, we ready to start? Okay. All right, sorry about that, everyone. Welcome back. Glad to see you all. My name is Lina Kassim, MBA class of 2021 at Yale. I currently work for the U.S. Development Finance Corporation in the Admission Transaction Unit as a relationship manager covering West and Francophone Africa. Outside of that, I'm one of the co-founders, members of the Yale Africa Startup Review, and I serve as a Chief Growth Officer of Recore Medical, a company designing reusable core needle biopsy device to increase access to cancer treatment. While at Yale, I worked at Sci-City as a portfolio manager, and I was able to take advantage of the initiative WE at Yale. It's a cross-campus initiative for women entrepreneurs and innovators at Yale. Their mission is to empower student leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs to launch and lead their startups, their projects, or organizations. The Women Innovators Series, which they run, is designed to foster community discussion, idea sharing, and best practice in support of Yale women and non-binary femme entrepreneurs and innovators. We are very grateful for your attendance at this conference, and we have a fantastic panel for you today. First, our moderator, Edith Mukundi, Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at UCLA. Her research examines the various learning models for diverse populations of learners with a focus on equity and inclusion for marginalized and vulnerable populations, including children and youth, ethnic minorities, women, population in rural areas, and those in conflict impact spaces. She is also involved in development intervention programming in the areas of education and food security in Africa. We also have Sefi Achesa, who's a PhD candidate in higher education administration at Illinois State University. She researches higher education finance in California, holds a bachelor's in economics, a master's in training and development. She has taught in women and gender studies and on historical and social foundations of education. She's also a lecturer at UCLA. Last but certainly not least, we have Laurene Meiner, who is a PhD candidate in comparative and international education at UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences. She currently serves as a teaching fellow in microeconomics and public affairs at UCLA and is an active member and graduate student coordinator for the Human Development and Capabilities Association. Before UCLA, she obtained her PhD in economics, where her research focused on labor economics of gender, economics of education, and welfare economics. She has 12 years of university teaching experience and has also worked in the public sector. Once again, welcome everyone. You can put your questions in the chat. Welcome, ladies, and Edith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. The theme for the conference is Through the Eyes of She. As scholars and women who identify with the condition of women in development context, Laurene is an adoptive girl of the people of Butere, Kenya. Sefi is Nyauboro. For those of you who may know something about community pride in Kenya, and I am Nyamalo, or daughter of the Delta of Lake Lolwe, or as Westerners would later call it, Lake Victoria. We are honored to have the opportunity to represent the many women and girls whose voices are not heard because they do not have access to the platform that we are privileged to have today. It is our hope that we will share their experiences through our own work and in raising their voices as we share our thoughts and understanding of the plight of Kenyan women and girls at this forum. Our team today is made up of Laurene Meiner, Sefi Achesa, and I, Edith Mukundi Omwami. We are all members of the UCLA academic community. We come to this work informed by our interest in the empowerment and well-being of girls and women in our society and across national borders in shared lived experiences. Indeed, we have put in our time and effort and continue to do so to contribute in any way we can to the empowerment of girls and women whose lives have crossed our path with our own personal lives and many whose life journeys might never intersect with our own. We are three women among many whose contribution to the empowerment and well-being of girls and women is demonstrable in scholarship, practice, and advocacy. It is an honor to have the opportunity to present at this forum. While I will be moderating the session, the presentation is a collaborative effort of the three of us, and we hope that we will share our voiced concerns and promises in promoting the uplifting of girls in educational setting in order to help empower them in their future ways, in ways that women in their situation a generation before could not actualize. Our topic is informed by the United Nations 2015 Sustainable Development Goal 4 and Sustainable Development Goal 5, that is education and women and girls empowerment. Our focus is limited to the education sector. We do appreciate, however, that the consideration of the totality of the social context of women is important in any effort to program around empowerment of women. In consideration of the current pandemic context, we sought to explore the impact on educational effort to empower women and girls. Our contribution focuses on primary and secondary schooling in Kenya. For the purpose of this presentation, we have shared responsibility in presenting our thoughts and ideas within our limited understanding of the pandemic context. Our presentation will proceed in the following order. Laurene will go first, sharing with us background context. I will follow her with an exploration of the impact of the pandemic, and Sefi will come in after me with the governmental response to the pandemic and the implications for educational attainment of girls. Sefi will then yield to Laurene to conclude for our team. The title of our presentation is The Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic on the Education of Kenyan Girls, Evidence of Ongoing Challenges, Substantial Setbacks, and Direction for the Future. I welcome Laurene Meiner in leading us in presentation.
Thank you, Edith. Thank you, Edith. I'll share my screen. Hopefully it'll work. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Omwami, and thank you to the Yale community for allowing us to present this important information about the status of girls' education in Kenya in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we begin, the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Gabrielina and Tongva peoples. We will begin with a discussion of the status of girls' education before the pandemic, and then move on to a discussion of the impact of COVID-19 on girls' education in Kenya, followed by consideration of the government response, as well as innovations and opportunities for future research. Thanks to the generous assistance of Dr. Ruth Onyango, who first served as the mentor of Dr. Omwami, we were able to pursue field work in 2018 and 2019. Our focus was on documenting the status and educational barriers of girls who are left behind in order to amplify the voices of marginalized women and girls. In 2018, we followed up with students in Embu with whom Dr. Amwami had worked 20 years prior. Sadly, all but one of the girls had left their villages and when they were married, and their parents knew little about their current situation. In 2019, in collaboration with the local community in Western Kenya, we performed interviews with adolescent students at 4 schools. As a result of those interviews, it became clear that adolescent girls want higher education, but very few will make it. There's also a backlash to girls' education evident in protests by boys and behavior of men. In addition, emphasis on the discipline of girls doesn't offer a viable solution to gender-based violence, harassment, and HIV. As many of you are aware, the marginalization of women in economic terms also affects education. Colonizers replaced tribal community living arrangements with European economic and social structures that marginalize girls' education and reduce their social status. The legacy of colonialism intersects with poverty, patriarchy, and discriminatory gender norms to create multifaceted barriers to girls' education. I'll begin with a discussion of the pre-pandemic context in Sub-Saharan Africa in general. The average number of years of schooling for girls in Sub-Saharan Africa is 9 and is as low as 5 in some countries. Only 9 countries have achieved gender parity at the upper secondary school level and 0 at the tertiary level. Sub-Saharan girls' secondary school completion rate is 24.6%, and Sub-Saharan girls' secondary school out-of-school rate is 59.8%. Sexual harassment, social sanctioning, and gender-based violence among adolescent girls contributes to school dropouts, pregnancies, HIV, and other STIs. Drilling in on the status in Kenya, significant progress at the primary school was achieved thanks to the MDGs, but also, as many of you know, during the MDGs, focus on investment was at the primary school level. Therefore, there was limited progress at the secondary school level. Currently, Kenya ranks 15th in progress in achieving the SDGs among sub-Saharan African signatories. There are also rural and urban, as well as gender disparities. In addition, Kenyan educational progress has stalled. The mean years of schooling remained flat at 6.5 years. The ratio of female to male years of schooling actually fell to 80%. Only 38% of women will complete upper secondary school. And among rural students, there's a 27% graduation rate. There are also quality concerns. Only 3 children in 10 in class 3 can do the work of class 2, and 8 in 10 students in class 8 can do the work of class 2. Kenya has made additional efforts. In 2017, they instituted a competency-based curriculum and switched to a 2-6-3-3-3 educational system. This was intended to improve curriculum quality and provide job-related skills. Also, in 2018, they devolved funding to the county level and addressed a fixed allocation per student. Unfortunately, this was only about half of what was needed to make education affordable for parents. School fees are still prohibitive and on average are 6 to 10 times the income of the average rural parent. In 2018, they also instituted 100% secondary school transition policy, offering spots to all students in the 9th grade, regardless of their 8th grade test scores. Unfortunately, there were ongoing failures in enforcement of transition and in persistence. There's also insufficient infrastructure and as well as the quality and quantity of teachers, particularly in rural areas. There's class overcrowding. Typically, we observed in the field 80 students per class. There's little time for low performing students and a high rate of teacher burnout. What we know so far about education and women's well-being is that primary school is not transformative. The work of Dr. Amwami demonstrates that women's empowerment outcomes across generations have not changed significantly as a result of the improvements in schools so far. Also, secondary school completion and beyond is associated not only with health and income gains, but also with improved gender dynamics and women's agency. It's also been demonstrated that girls understand the value of education and have a voice in their own persistence, but their aspirations adapt to the substantive freedoms that they enjoy. I'll now move to Dr. Amwami, who will present the impact on girls' education of the COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic upended the educational enterprise globally in ways that has never been or had never been contemplated. It did not matter whether you are a child in a wealthy geographic or household setting, the impact was immediate and universal. The most obvious outcome is that the pandemic-related educational setbacks have further compounded the pre-existing challenges for girls' education. To my colleagues, Laurene, she has already alluded to what the condition was pre-pandemic. In the interest of time saving, I will focus on three general areas of the impact. That is educational, health, and social, as well as psychosocial. With respect to the educational impact, the declaration of the pandemic led to mass school closures, resulting in disruption in learning and as well as disruption in the school calendar schedules globally. Kenyan schools were closed for almost a full year, and the first return to schooling compounded the challenges of learning loss because some students came back, others did not. School closures left youth, including girls, exposed and at a risk of increased vulnerabilities to drop out due to increased time to completion. Outside of school experiences also, increased possibility of not returning. Some children found priority engagements, including contributing to family well-being, and there are also those who dropped out who might never return just because of that break in schooling. School closures have also contributed to learning losses in terms of disrupting learning, which means lost time in learning. Changed learning context itself has failed the test of efficiency in pedagogy. Not many teachers were prepared for online transition, for example, and also teachers, some of them don't have the skills to actually work with technology, which was a prerequisite for the shift to online learning. This will contribute to low achievement and grade repetition with implications for education attainment for girls and women. The year-long school closures also have implications for educational attainment, as some will have dropped out, and also because of low achievement resulting as a result of learning loss, particularly for vulnerable girls, there is a likelihood of increased low achievement, education attainment for women and girls. It also has implications for workforce skills development, as delayed entry into the labor force impacts women, but more important, the women, the young girls who are missing out on learning and therefore end up with low education attainment are going to have low placement in the workplace because of limited skills, availability, accessibility. For those who may have accessed online education, girls in rural areas and low socioeconomic status were actually impacted with respect to the experience with online learning and distance learning, as many did not have access to the technology. Next, please. Crisis and emergency situations tend to be accompanied by increase in gender-based violence. This is true of civil war as well as natural catastrophes, as safety nets for women and girls are often disrupted. The global pandemic created conditions that increased opportunities for girls and women to become more vulnerable. Closures, for example, of boarding schools and day schools as safe spaces were suddenly lost by millions of girls and young women. This led to increased time in isolation. The result was that the pandemic increased exposure to physical violence and gender-based violence. Girls engaged in intimacy relationship, for example, are more vulnerable to intimate partner violence, and girls were also subject to increased gender-based violence within the family setup and also within their community. Increased isolation from other teens and youth networks also denied children and youth social interaction spaces and contacts as well. This has implications for girls' well-being. As a result, therefore, what has been noted is that mental well-being of children and youth has been adversely affected by the isolation as a result of the pandemic closure. Next, please. The pandemic has had a negative impact on the reproductive health of girls and young women. While the problem of girls leaving school as a result of pregnancy in Kenya is a perennial problem, as early as June 2020, there was concerns about dramatic increases in girls' pregnancies. Exposure to pregnancy-related complications, childbirth complications, and STI were therefore increased as a result of the pandemic. Closure of workplaces and reduced service delivery also compromised access to health services for girls. This would lead to the limited access to reproductive health services with impact on their health outcomes. The increasing unwanted pregnancies and untreated STIs, and also the combination of reproductive health and psychosocial impact induced disorders such as stress-related menstrual cycle disruptions. Increased budgetary allocation towards dealing with the pandemic also took away resources for delivery of health services, and that has negative impact for the health of young women and girls as well. Next slide, please. Workplace closures due to pandemic compromised family income. Both the formal and the informal sector actually, job losses were lost, leading to decline of vulnerability in terms of family well-being. And this compromised girls' well-being as well, and it also has compromised their education. As you have and will hear, there are costs still involved, and with job losses, therefore, poor and vulnerable, socioeconomically vulnerable households would not afford the extra payments. More girls were therefore pushed into poverty by the pandemic. School closures also have compromised the education of girls in terms of increasing burden of youth and adult in poverty. So their future well-being is also compromised as well. Those who persist are going to have limited skills because of learning losses, and vulnerability is more for the rurality and early marriages context when it comes to the most vulnerable amongst the girl child population. School closures also created isolation, and time spent in isolation did expose some girls to sex trafficking. What has been noted is that sex trafficking of girls actually moved online. So there is both sex trafficking and pornography exploitation going on as well for girl child as well as all children. There is also documented increase in child marriages and transactional sex as a result of the pandemic. The evidence is there that if the pandemic didn't lead to school closures, some of the girls who are actually expectant would not have dropped out of school. I will now turn over to my colleague, Sefi Achesa, to continue with our presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Mwami. And I'll be talking about the Kenyan government response. As a direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Kenya Ministry of Education closed down all schools from K through 16. Unfortunately, there was no contingency plan for continuity of education. This single action resulted in 16% of girls not returning to school in January 2021. Now, when these students did not return to school, most of them either were married early, and we are talking about students from the age of 10 and above getting married. Some of them had unwanted pregnancies, and this particularly affected the girl child very, very negatively. Now, there was also loss of interest in school, and the girl child had preference for looking for low-skilled jobs such as house helps. Additionally, some private schools were permanently closed, resulting in reduced educational opportunities and increased vulnerability for girls. In September 2020, some schools in Kenya were partially opened, but the Kenyan Ministry of Education was more concerned with advancing a new education system, which is called the Competency-Based Curriculum, CBC in parentheses, and only brought back 4th graders, 8th graders, and 12th graders, leaving the other students at home with no apparent educational activities going on. Please move on to the next slide. Many students in K through 12 schools were unable to access online content due to lack of laptops or Wi-Fi connectivity. As a result, most students did not undertake any type of classes for approximately 1.5 years. In an effort to accomplish their 100% transition policy, the Kenya Ministry of Education started canvassing households for students who had completed the Kenya Certificate of Primary Education, KCPE, to attend secondary schools. The Ministry of Education has not put in place mechanisms to account for persistence and completion in K through 12 grades, and have not addressed the real reasons for delayed enrollment in secondary schools. As a matter of fact, the Kenyan government erroneously purports to have free K through 12 education, when in fact, secondary education in Kenya costs between Kenya shillings 20,000 to Kenya shillings 50,000. In US dollars, that would be between $200 and $500 annually. This misconception in tuition costs and school fees has prohibited transition to high-performing secondary schools, leaving girls and their parents to opt for lower-performing schools that charge lower tuition and lower fees, but are compromised in the quality of education that they provide. Next slide, please. Kenyan students in K through 16 are facing inadequate public health protocols for return to school. These include overcrowded classrooms with approximately 70 to 72 students per class per teacher, overcrowded workspaces with 3 to 4 students occupying desks meant for 1 to 2 students, and a transportation system that does not adhere to COVID-19 safety protocols. Many low-cost and private schools will not reopen due to financial difficulties and a lack of human resources. As a result, there are challenges for reduced access and opportunities for girls. Additionally, the schools that are currently open will be overcrowded, and the few resources available will be exhausted quickly by the demand by the large number of students. I will now turn the presentation over to Laurene, who will discuss innovations and takeaways. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening so far. We just wanted to finish up with a discussion of some innovations and opportunities for future research. Currently, Kenya has the third highest teen pregnancy rate in East Africa after Tanzania and Uganda. In January 2021, Kenya opened its first school for teen mothers in the wake of a 40% surge in teenage pregnancy. Schools for young mothers may offer a pathway back to school and a welcome reprieve from social sanctioning for many girls. More schools and efforts like these that address girls' day-to-day needs are required if we are to achieve lasting change in education. In addition, an integration of network technology into the school curriculum at the primary and secondary school levels may help students remain engaged. However, further study is needed to determine the extent to which this promotes education quality and continuity for girls, particularly when they're at home and may be asked to do other chores and/or activities to generate income at home. Lastly, redundant and low-tech solutions may be needed in order to ensure education continuity in the wake of potential future crises related to climate change and other pandemics. So overall, the takeaways that we have given our presentation are that the satisfactory achievement of SDGs 4 and 5 will require consideration of the impact of global pandemics and other crises on girls' education. Gendered processes that deepen during adolescence must be addressed in order to improve girls' substantive freedom to pursue education in times of calm and crisis. Preliminary evidence indicates that the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated the gender divide in education. Girl-focused local interventions are needed in order to ensure the continuity of education in times of crisis, including expanded technological access, and crisis response plans that are not technology dependent. And that is the end of our presentation. If anyone has any questions, I don't know if you've found any in the chat, Edith or Dr. Momi.
May I ask that our participants, Sefi and Laurene, you unmute, and then from the audience, if you have a question or comment, to voice it for the benefit of everybody else. We'll try our best to actually respond to the questions that are going to be raised. So any question, please just unmute yourself or raise your hand. I might see, and you are invited. Any question or comment from the audience, participants?
The questions will be in the chat, Dr. Mwami.
Okay, so the first one I notice here is, should schools make contraceptions be more available for young people to have safe sex? Clearly, abstain doesn't work. Maybe it's time for Africa to learn. So the question is directed to the audience. So I will go first with a response in terms of understanding the context for Kenya. So although it makes logical sense for contraceptives to be readily available in schools as a space that young people, youth have access or immediate access, we understand the politicization of the whole process. So as an alternative, I would suggest that we also explore other avenues of dissemination of reproductive health services. Some of my colleagues have actually done some work in Kenya, working with some providers, health providers, to open up accessibility through a peer-to-peer kind of strategy. And that is not only much more relaxing accessibility environment for young people when it comes to reproductive health services, but it removes the contesting of the school building and the school as a space where this politics might actually continue going on. So making it possible for health services spaces to have peer mentors and peer front spaces for youth to access health services might actually be a much more efficient and convenient avenue of making it possible and bypassing the politics of whether or not reproductive health services can be and should be delivered in schools. We also know that there is resistance not just to the delivery of the services, but also to teaching about reproductive health services within. And so this is where I would suggest also that taking advantage of social media platforms to be able to develop information knowledge platforms that youth can access and in a format that they can actually relate to, but also considering that there are some youth who don't have access to technology, and think about them as you work to expand this knowledge and information sharing through social media platform. I'll leave it to pass to my colleagues to also add on if they have something else to add.
I understand the audience question. I think it's an important one, but I really like your solution, Dr. Mwame, because we have observed in the field and are aware of laws in Kenya that actually prevent discussion of many issues related to sex within the schools. So unfortunately, developing a comprehensive program of sex education is very difficult with these types of restrictions. And even with regard to HIV, the students are taught the symptoms of HIV, but not necessarily taught how to prevent getting HIV. So in light of that, I think going around the system the way that Dr. Mwame is suggesting is perhaps the only solution, unless, you know, the policies within Kenya can be changed in terms of how girls are allowed to be spoken to. When we spoke with administrators and teachers in the school environment about sexual harassment, about harassment of girls in upper primary and secondary school, their general response was girls just need to be more disciplined and we need to guide and counsel them. So although in the West, we might see that as insufficient, I think in context, it's very difficult to change those perceptions quickly. So perhaps working through other networks might be an initial step that would eventually change the government's perspective in that matter. So, yeah. Sefi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I would agree with my colleagues, but I would like to add that one of the issues we have in schools in Kenya pertaining to reproductive health is there's no separation of church and state. And so there is a lot of confusion and a thin line that most educators do not want to cross. Additionally, I would say that parents or guardians need to empower themselves. I really don't believe in people being empowered. I believe in self-empowerment and educate their children or the children that may be adoptive or the children that they are guarding, because you will find that in most homes, sexual health or reproductive health is kind of a taboo. It's not taught. And then these students are also not taught in school. So where are they learning this information? So it's almost like a trial and error thing, or maybe they're going to the library and they find maybe some magazines, I don't know. So it's kind of, it's a catch-22 situation. We are trying to have them not engage in sexual activities. At the same time, we are not trying to teach them how they can protect themselves. And you find that in some environments, even just talking about condoms is prohibitive. And so there's a lot of work, and I agree with Dr. Mwame that we have to go around it. We have to find a way to get to these students. So probably the peer-to-peer is a good idea. We need to look at other ways in which non-governmental organizations can come in without conflicting with the government, because the government is very picky about what is being taught to the students. What are you doing? Are you teaching them to become excessively sexual? But that's not the issue. The thing is, you have 10-year-olds engaging in sex right now without understanding what they're really doing. So I'll stop there, but it's a very touchy topic. Thank you.
Yeah, when we say government, we actually mean patriarchal bureaucracies, because that's essentially what we have to deal with. and patriarchal bureaucracies, in the sense that while not necessarily making it possible for youth to have empowering knowledge and information to make decisions for themselves, they actually end up compromising the future of the same youth. Now, in our presentation, we also mentioned that because of the pandemic, many youth actually in isolation turned to online connection and connectivity. So while this is actually for the youth who have access to technology, it did increase their access to information, some of which might be misleading and harmful to them. Part of it is exposure to sex trafficking online, and the other is also exposure to pornography, both of which do not necessarily teach you how to protect yourself. So even though there is a problem with respect to not being able to access the information at school, you have the same youth accessing information that actually increases their vulnerability. In the context of developed country context, like I'm thinking what is happening in some of the schools in this country, in the US, we actually have wellness now being taught in some schools as part of the curricula. So just addressing issues of gender, sexuality, reproductive health in that space might actually benefit our children.
Edith, we lost your mic. Okay.
Can you talk more about the schools for pregnant teen girls? Are these a complete alternative track? Do girls re-enter general school after they attend this school? Are they able to transition to higher education with credential? Maybe Laurene, you can talk to this.
Yeah, well, this, as I mentioned, it was this first school of its kind was just opened in January 2021, and even interviews with students, the girls were still very sheepish about the fact that they attended that school. So there's still persistent social sanctioning for these girls, that even though they have this access to this school is affecting the way they perceive themselves. But my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Amwami, but my understanding is that if they pass their 12th grade exams and they get that far, that they could then proceed to higher education. And also that you can return in Kenya to school at any time, even if you're at a different age, and you can take your 8th grade exam or your 12th grade exam, even if you're out of the age category. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I can also add that that is a non-governmental effort. It's not a public school, public originated school. Now, one of the challenges with schools established by non-governmental organizations, especially the local schools, is that most of them are not accredited. And without accreditation, then it does not matter how many years you spend at that school, your credits will not transfer. So it is therefore imperative that we work to see that any institution that is established is actually accredited in order for us to have a meaningful outcome in empowerment through education for women and girls. Otherwise, they will have all the knowledge and perhaps all the skills they need, but without accreditation, the worthiness of their education on the labor market, the formal sector especially, might not actually be worth it. Yes, they might be able to perform in the informal sector because they now have skills, but the problem still remains that many children, and this impacts mostly the low-income background children, including girls, who attend these non-accredited schools, face problems and challenges transitioning through the formal school system.
Hmm. And are they allowed to take their 12th grade exams?
If they're taking the 12th grade exam, it means it's a recognized testing center. So the possibility is that maybe that particular institution is therefore accredited.
So I guess more of those schools are needed and linkages. Have you observed any of those, Sefi?
Actually, no. It's been a little bit interesting with the shutdowns because of COVID-19. But I agree with you that we need more of those schools, particularly if we take the understanding that roughly 16% of girls did not show up to school in January 2021, but also those are only 16% of the girls who had been in school prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But you have a larger percentage of girls generally not attending school, and pregnancy or early marriages complicates that fact. So I will be honest and say that I have not witnessed that kind of school here. But I will be looking out to see, or doing a little bit more research to see if some of them are springing up. But I'm aware of non-governmental organizations providing opportunities for students of all ages, regardless of marital status or anything, to go to school. But I like what Dr. Mwami said about accreditation, because sometimes they go to those schools, but then they cannot sit for the national exams, which means then they cannot advance to the next levels. So there's a lot of work still needed to get particularly the girl child, because you will find that although Kenya has a different, it's kind of a multicultural environment, because you have different tribes with different cultures, but overall the boy child is favored over the girl child. So even in a family, let's say a family of 4 with 2 boys and 2 girls, it will be preferred for the boys to go to school and the girls to help around in the home. Not to mention that when it comes to the students, particularly the girl child who lives in the rural areas, the girl child is the one who walks 10 or 15 miles looking for water for the family, fetching firewood, while the boy child is studying at home. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area.
Okay, so there is this, I think, because we are about to run out of time, this last question, which is interesting in your work. Do you think about how to bring boys into conversations of gender? So I can say that I am not necessarily practicing directly right now in the field, but as at the time at which I was doing field work, I was interacting mostly with adults. I work in schools with children, but I look at a different area in terms of the kind of work I do. So working with families, the question I often raised with parents is if they would like their sons to marry a girl that is not educated or one that has not gone to school. And the answer was always no. So I would ask, why would you think the other father would want their son to marry a girl that is not educated? Then the other is, there is increasing evidence that many of the young women who had access to education now actually carry a burden or responsibility of supporting their families. So looking at that context in itself has become a lesson for many parents, and the reality is that many parents actually think positively about their girls' and daughters' experiences, and therefore are more open to accessing education for them. But there was, and this was magnified more in the context of the pandemic, a lot of backlash against the girl child. In Kenya now, we talk about the boy child. And realistically speaking, many of us have looked at strategies in education sector intervention that tend to focus on empowering the girl, but leaving behind the vulnerable boys, has in itself created a problem, because there is that antagonistic relationship between what the boys perceive the girls to be getting. So it's not that we don't want to promote our girls or to pull them back. We are just looking at vulnerabilities for both girls and boys would actually be more or less compounded depending on context. So a girl in a wealthier household definitely has advantages that a boy in a poor household does not have. Now, I'm going to talk about the issue of being specific to targeting just girls. What has ended up happening is we have this imbalance of these young girls that have actually been able to benefit from this empowerment efforts that we've been putting in place. But on the other hand, we also have young men, and I'm looking at the older ones that are now in college or just leaving college. They are colleagues or contemporaries who are young men who are also from vulnerable backgrounds whom we left behind. There was about 2 years ago, actually a convention, worship convention in Nairobi, facilitating prayers for professional young women to get husbands. And I do not want to discount the motive, interest, and desire. But the reality is, it did not matter how much they prayed. The young men they would have partnered with of the same socio-economic status were left behind. So whatever happened, I don't think the answers would be realized if the desire is to have a partner in life from amongst the men in society. So in a way, therefore, what this means is we have to actually rethink our intervention strategies and talk about vulnerabilities in terms of rights and human rights, rather than just being specific to place gender and gender identity to it. Let's talk about wholesome wellness for societies and wholesome wellness for all members of our community. For me, that is where I would be. But I know also that in developed country context, there are efforts right now to integrate both boys and girls in discussions about wellness. So I see something positive happening. I'm only hoping that that can be extended to other spaces, especially in the case of Kenya as well.
Yeah, and
colleagues.
I think I would add one thing to that, and is that, you know, in many of the rural villages, they still have the Simba houses, which are houses for young men. And so even we interviewed both boys and girls in our visits to the 4 schools in Western Kenya. And while there were boys who acknowledged the need for girls to go to school and actually said that they wanted to marry girls who were more educated, there still is this divide because girls are kept at home, and whereas the boys are, once they hit puberty, are in separate places and able to, more free to do whatever they like. And I think that sort of compounds this feeling of privilege for the boys, in the sense that they have the freedom of movement that they'd like to have. And also girls are often, you know, made victims because of simple things like needing a ride to school and getting a ride from a boda driver who expects something in exchange for that ride to school. So I think there needs to be education even beyond just sexual reproductive health, but even in finding safe ways for girls to go to and from school in rural environments, and in providing them more freedom to express themselves.
Sorry, can I just say that because of time constraints, we have to come to an end.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody for attending and participating in our panel. At this point, we'll take about 5 minutes short break. If you haven't already, please make sure to fill out the survey for the panel. The link to the survey can be found in the chat box. We will reconvene again in 5 minutes for the closing session. Thank you. So I think we are done, most everybody.
Yes, I think we're done.
Megan, are you there?